Hello, and welcome to Message in the Middle with Marianne. We all know that life is hard, right? It's messy, it's unpredictable, but it can be wonderful all at the same time. My hope is that we can take a deep dive into self-development topics and explore life's lessons through book clubs, conversations, and interviews. And together, we can uncover the lessons that others have already learned to help us navigate this crazy, wonderful ride called life. Hello and welcome to Message in the Middle with Marianne. As many of the listeners know, based on a request in our Facebook community, I put together a series of episodes on death and grief and related topics. And like so many other things that happen to us in life, I just happened to come across today's guest at the right time because her story unfortunately fits perfectly into that series. So today I have Dr. Victoria Wilson Crane with me. And Dr. Crane is a published author. Her book is called 16 Days, A Sudden Death, What to Say. And she's also an advanced grief recovery method specialist. Hello, Dr. Crane. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me today.
And I have to call you doctor the whole time because I know it's not a medical, but I feel like people work so hard to get that title that they deserve to be called doctor. So we'll keep the formality in. So I'm hoping that you can kind of kick us off and share some of the backstory that led you to writing the book. And I know it's, a tragedy for your family, but I do think it sort of sets the tone for how we got here and how you got into this work. So can you share that with us?
Yeah, sure, definitely. Thank you. And just in terms of the doctor thing, it is a lot of work for two little letters.
Right.
So but please don't feel like you have to use it. Yeah, so why am I here then? And actually the doctor isn't too much to do with what I'm doing, but there is a little bit of a link. So my only niece, 22, just graduated from an undergraduate degree in law, was pursuing a postgraduate course and was enjoying her studies and had what we expected to be a pretty bright future ahead of her. And she became unwell, and it was early January 2020. And kind of pre-COVID, and it wasn't anything to do with COVID, but it was a kind of viral illness that she had, which took hold quite quickly. Within a few days, she was hospitalised. And then within a couple of days of that, she unfortunately died. Quite just sort of something happening so suddenly, so quickly to someone who was unwell, but wasn't, as we thought, gravely unwell at the time. It was just such an enormous shock to our really small family. I think sort of skipping forward, that the reason I ended up writing about it was just trying to find some way for me to kind of process that sense of loss, that sense of grief. Partly because, and I thought about this sometime afterwards, but it seemed to make sense to me that I was very close to my niece, and I've told you I was, she was my only niece. But we weren't in touch every day, but we were, a really close, small family. So, and I'd never thought about it before, but it was only when things started to emerge about plans around informing people that she'd died and then preparing for her funeral that I got this sense that I'm a little bit on the outside of this. There were people in that scenario much closer than I was. So she had a long-term boyfriend. She had two sets of parents, grandparents, brothers, and it just left me feeling, hang on, I feel like I've got to do a lot for them and be there for them. Not that anyone asked me to do any of that stuff, but you just kind of fall in line and you do what's kind of expected of you. So I needed something really for me. And actually, when I started writing, I had no intention of it being a book and no intention really of that story being out there. But it was only being part of a writing group that got me to consider, actually, if I was to write this down and share it with people, there may be some learning in that for others. So that, in a nutshell, is how 16 Days really came about.
And I think it's important you touched on it, that the book is not just a memoir. And I hate to say just, but I want to say just, because it's also a guidebook. It's a framework to help people understand what grief can look like, how to deal with grief for themselves, for others around them, And I think that's important, right? It's, again, not just the story, which of course is a horrific tragedy, but the something good that can come out of that is you have some lessons learned there that you're trying to help people and share with people.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that the kind of key to that is in the subtitle. So, a sudden death, what to say? Because so many people said to me and to our family, I don't know what to say.
Yeah.
And I've been there myself. I've, felt like I couldn't find the words, didn't know what to say. You know you can't really make things much better, but you desperately don't want to make things worse either. So people can avoid you. People can avoid saying things even if they speak to you. So there was a little bit within the stories that, and 16 days comes from the days between her death and the funeral, because just some slightly unusual things happened. Hopefully some amusing things happened as well, because we do find humour in all sorts of situations that help us get through. Some sad stories in there. But at the end of each chapter, I added that bit quite sort of late on in the writing process. At the end of each chapter, there's just a few points, a few bullet points of things to say. If you are aware of somebody who's dealing with a bereavement or dealing with a loss, here's some things that might work. And I don't at all profess to be any kind of expert on this. I know grief is a deeply unique experience. But there have been some common things, and actually feedback that I've had from people that have read the book have said, yeah, actually, I identified some things that there were some things that I knew I'd done right. There are some things that I thought, actually, next time that situation occurs, I might do something a little bit different as a result of what you've said. And that was vaguely reassuring and comforting that at least, as you say, some sort of good may have come from that situation for me.
Well, and one of those things that I think you hit on, and you and I touched on briefly when we first talked, was around letting people understand or helping people understand how they might frame up their questions when they check in with people a little bit differently. And honestly, I don't think I really ever thought about it in the way that you share. So I'd love for you to put that out there so the audience can kind of hear that, because it's just a little twist, right? It's just a little way to look at it a little differently and help frame it up differently.
Yeah, I think although we're part of a small family, we're in a community where lots and lots of people did want to help and support. But what was difficult was when people said, if there's anything you need, we're here. Which is the obvious thing to say. And actually, I've said it again just recently to a friend, because it's just it's an easy thing to say. It's quite a gentle thing to say, because it doesn't presuppose that you know what they might want. But actually, having been in that situation, I just wanted somebody who would provide me with some concrete either action or advice or support, rather than saying, I'm here if you need me, or if there's anything you need, let me know. So I have got in a better habit of actually offering and saying, would you like me to do this or that? Or tell you what, I'm going to the supermarket. Can I get this or that for you? Or can I do that today? Or can I do that tomorrow for you? Just to try and give people a little bit of agency, because you don't want to take over everything, but just to also offer some things. So if you know what their food likes and dislikes are, or if you know what their dietary preferences or needs are, that's great. Or, something bland, that something is helpful for them. But you're not taking away all their power, but you're just offering something concrete that the response of the griever is, yes, thank you, that's great.
I really like that suggestion. I think it's a great tip for people to keep in mind. The less open-ended, I think the possibility of being able to be impactful and help is probably higher. Similarly, you offer up some advice around how to check in with people, how to ask, we always want to say, well, how are you doing? Or how you feeling? And I know that now you would advise against that type of question. So what's your advice in that space?
Again, just sort of narrow that frame of reference, because if the question is, how are you? The answer's not going to be good.
Yeah, crappy.
Yeah, terrible, dreadful, awful, all of those words.
Or okay, right? It depends if they're being honest or not, but yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Or you might get, yeah, okay. But actually, yeah, if you narrow that, how are you doing this morning? or how's it for you now? How's this afternoon? Is a little bit more focused, and it enables people as well. It also gives people a bit of permission to be okay at the minute, because grief is not a linear experience. And I think what can be difficult is those sort of short moments, and sometimes over time those short moments get a bit longer. It's not, let's say, it's not linear, but in those short, brief moments when you do feel okay, it's all right to be all right at the moment. So to get a response of, actually, this last half hour, I've thought about something else, or I've concentrated on something else, is a massive step for somebody who's in shock and in grief. So I find sort of saying, how's it going for you this morning, or how are you this evening, or how are you feeling right now? It's just a little bit more focused, and is a little bit more answerable.
Yeah.
It does give the person the option to say, actually, just this minute I'm okay.
Yeah.
Or this morning I was all right, but this afternoon I'm awful. Rather than the very open-ended, how are you? Because there's possibly is only one answer to that.
Yeah. Again, I like that. And I just don't think most of us think of that, right? I think we think we're asking, we're checking in. It's the right thing to do, but I don't think it's typically an open-ended question. So it's definitely a different way to reframe it. So you hit on how this isn't a linear journey. I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions that people have about grief and the grief journey. Is there anything else that jumps out at you as a misconception that people have?
Yeah, I think so. And some of this links with the work that I've done since with the grief recovery method. So you mentioned that I'm a grief recovery method specialist, and that's some training that I've had to help people through an academic program. And that's kind of where the doctorate comes back in, because my doctorate is in education. I'm an educator by my main job. And I've learned to teach this learning program that's out there, and it's available, and I now help clients through it. And one of the first things that we do as part of that process is explore some of what we call the myths of grief in the method, because unless we understand where our current thoughts are around grief, it's hard to actually think about it differently, because society has told us some things, our close family will have told us some things, we'll have seen things on the television that suggest what we ought to be doing and feeling when grief hits. And to try and explore why you're not feeling that way, or why actually you are feeling that way and it's not helpful, is a really good place to start. So just in terms of the myths of grief, the one that you kind of mentioned was just around about the sort of grief being linear, and that there are stages of grief. And actually where that comes from is work by very, very experienced educator, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And she tried to help people who were facing a terminal illness diagnosis. And that's where the stages of grief come from. And she talked about the ways that people might go through the bargaining, the acceptance at the end, all those kinds of stages. And from what I understand, a journalist got hold of it and reframed it as the stages of grief. And I understand that she spent much of the remainder of her career trying to debunk that and suggest that wasn't quite what I meant. Thank you very much for taking that on board. That wasn't quite what I meant, because actually, if somebody has died, there's no bargaining to be done. That bargaining comes from a phase where, as I understand that model, it's around the sense of trying to come to terms with something that's happening, not something that's already happened. Mm. So definitely the one of those myths of grief, just around grief being in a linear, or asking somebody actually which phase of grief you're in, because you go around in circles, and you can be at one stage one day and then another stage the next, or one stage 1 hour and another stage the next. That's really, really not so helpful. Another one is around replacing the loss. And we've talked so far around grief being around death and bereavement, but grief is not only about death and bereavement of people. It can be around death of perhaps animal companions and pets that we have. And grief can be not about death at all. Grief can be about other losses. But the kind of replace the loss is a really interesting one, because if we think of young children and with pets, and if they have a pet, maybe if their dog or something like that, and the dog sadly dies, well, we'll get a different dog then, and we'll get a new dog. And we do that. Or even replace with something inanimate or with something else. And actually, if we learn that, okay, the way to cope then with grief is to just replace that loss. But what happens when somebody irreplaceable dies? So, significant member of the family and grandma dies, we can't just get another grandma. That's not how it works. So that's how some of these myths, although with all good intentions,
Yeah.
we set these tones, and we our children, we set them up to think, okay, well, if something happens to the pet, well, we can get the pet, and okay, it's never the same, but it's a different pet, and we've still got a pet. But with grandma, that's not so transferable. So that's another myth that we try and pull apart, because it's really, really tricky to suggest that, okay, well, the way that you deal with it is just by replacing the loss. And people sometimes replace losses with, as I say, with other things. And people will replace a loss with perhaps an unhealthy habit that they adopt. So that could be a drug habit or an alcohol habit. But yeah, we do explore those kinds of myths of grief, because I think it's really useful to know where somebody's coming from. If you're going to try and help them think of things in a different way, it's a good way to understand, okay, well, which of these resonate with you?
I was trying not to laugh for a moment there because it's a heavy topic, but I was thinking about my 3-year-old granddaughter and how we just took her to get her second pet fish because the first one died. And all right, I know everybody listening has a story like that, right? So we're not the worst grandparents and parents in the world. But the truth is, it's like so many other topics that we explore here on the show, in that we carry these small little nuances or hints about our identity and our beliefs from our childhood that could be all from well intentions, good intentions, but somehow they get skewed as we become adults and then give us these beliefs that we probably need to shed, right? And they're limiting beliefs in different ways. So
Right.
that's interesting. I want to go back for a second because you touched on something I was going to ask you, because I know we share this thought in common, that so many people think of grief in its most common form tied to death, right? And as you said, it can be tied to so many other things. I think, in fact, you quote like 40 common griefs or types of grief. I just want to give some examples of those because I'm trying to socialize that message with people throughout this series, because I don't think we often think of that. So I'd love to hear about some of those common types that are a little less known or thought of. And then also I want to understand how your recovery approach talks to how some of those past griefs can affect us in the present. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. And those two things are very, very connected. So if we first of all think about grief as a normal and natural reaction to loss, and that loss is most often, as you mentioned, considered around death and bereavement. But there could be other losses. So losses of hopes and dreams. So one of my colleagues, when I was doing my training, is a fertility coach, and she helps families who are going through support to try and have their own family. And I can totally identify with that, with the idea that you have your heart set on something that's going to happen, something really significant. And maybe that's not going to happen, or at least it hasn't happened this time. And she said day in, day out, she deals with people who are grieving because they're grieving something that hasn't actually happened yet, but they're grieving the idea that something might have happened, and the loss of what that might have looked like and what that might have been like. So that's a little bit of an intangible loss, but it's a loss nonetheless. I would say, obviously, that's for most people, that's another really sad one alongside bereavement. But there are some other losses around even happy events. So one that I think, again, I can identify with really closely around moving jobs. As part of my career, I've made really active choices to change jobs. I quite often say you shouldn't wait until you're really, really unhappy before you move on from somewhere, because I think it's very obvious to your next employer when you're in that kind of scenario. So I've been happy in roles and decided to move on and change and do something else. I've moved geographically for opportunities, that kind of thing. All of those opportunities have involved a job that maybe somebody might think about as having higher prestige or maybe a higher salary, but actually there's been a sense of loss around those because, again, grief, if we think about grief around the reaction to a loss of normal patterns of behaviour and change in normal patterns of behaviour, even around, and this might sound really trivial given some of the other things we've talked about today, but even around things like, I don't take the same route to work anymore, so I don't have the same view, or don't see the same people, or I don't buy my lunch in the same shop. All those sorts of things can lead us to a sense of grief. I don't have the same social routine anymore because I'm working with different colleagues, and it's great and I'm enjoying it, but actually there's a sense of grief. So there's a couple of losses there that maybe people might not be considering as impactful. But linking to what you said as well about grief is thought to accumulate, grief is thought to be something that builds up over time, unless we find a way to help us process it and deal with it. You can understand why, if you've had a number of, and this isn't a term I don't think, but kind of micro grief experiences, they can all build up over time, and then maybe something happens and there may be a loss that you think, why on earth am I reacting in this way? Because actually that person, maybe it has been a death, but that person wasn't that close to me. I didn't think I was attached to them, and yet I'm really, really feeling it. We in the UK have just experienced a period of mourning because our Queen has recently passed away. And there were lots of people saying, I can't believe how it's hit me, because I didn't know her personally, obviously. Most people didn't. But it's a change in circumstances. Our national anthem has just changed. It's not God Save the Queen any longer. And that sort of thing made me stop and think about it. I even had a moment when I realised that our banknotes were going to change, because throughout my entire life, our banknotes have featured our Queen, and they're not going to feature our Queen. And they'll be phased out, and there'll be time, and it'll all be okay, and I'm sure I'll get over it. But even things like that can, as I say, build up over time. And it can then be a case of perhaps a loss hitting us a little bit harder than we expect. But people then just scratch their heads and don't quite understand where that's come from. And I believe that comes from that kind of accumulation. So if we can use some tools, and so that's what we do with the grief recovery method, it helps prepare you for losses that might happen in the future, because they're surely going to still come. But it also helps you process what's happened in the past, which, from my own personal experience, and I've obviously been through the program myself, I just found I had a slightly more positive outlook on life. And that's all I offer to my clients. You will feel better as a result of this. I'm not saying you'll be healed and you'll be fixed, but you will feel better as a result of this.
I think that's an important topic too. And you and I touched on that as well. I think the misconception, again, back to that word, around getting through the grief or recovering from the grief, I think we both agreed that doesn't really happen. You just change, right? So what's your thought on that?
Yeah, and I've had a couple of potential clients who've become clients who've had challenges with that whole word recovery. And the method does define what we mean by recovery, and it definitely doesn't mean getting over it or moving on as in leaving behind, because we do become different people, whether it is through those sort of smaller elements of grief that shape us and mold us, or whether it's something a little bit more seismic, as kind of my experience. It's not about moving on. It's about learning to live with and learning to live around it and learning to take it with you. Because I think I have had clients say to me, I feel like I'm really not showing respect to the person I've lost if I try to move on from it, or if I try to leave them behind. And I do reassure them that that's not what we do. It's not about trying to help you put it in a box and forget about that person or that situation. So yeah, I think it's a really difficult one to try and imagine, okay, I'm going to recover from this. I'm going to get over this. But if we think about it more in recovery as feeling better than you do now, I think that's more of an honest offer that I can make.
Yeah, an incremental feeling of being able to go on with life in a different way. I agree.
Yeah.
You've touched on the grief recovery method lots throughout this. Obviously, it's the foundation you use for working with people. And I know we certainly can't get into the whole thing in this, next few minutes or whatever, but are there certain pieces or components that you sort of could just touch on so people have an idea of some of the tools or some of the tips that come out of it that might be useful?
Yeah, sure. It's available in book form, and actually people can go through this of their own volition as well. It doesn't need a therapist to take them through it. And I'm not a therapist. I'm just a specialist that can hold people's hand through it. And I personally found that useful because it was a kind of accountability and support for somebody. And there's a lot of active exercises, and I think that's one of the ways I found it the most powerful, because I'd had some talking therapy, I'd had counselling, which was somewhat useful, but for me at the time, I wanted to do something, as I said, that's going to make me feel better, and the counselling for me was just helping me tell the story over and over again, which in some cases that might be useful and it might be what people need, but it wasn't quite what I needed at the time. The book did that for me, I have to say. The book's given me that opportunity to tell that story and get that story out there. So I didn't feel at the time that the counselling was sort of moving me on. But the method takes you through a number of real action orientated steps. So one of those first things is exploring those myths of grief and working out where on earth we come from in this and what's driving the way that we think about our approach to grief. And then we look at plotting the different relationships that we've had and plotting the experiences we've had through those relationships and the losses that we've had. So it's quite an interesting process, because if I was to ask you now sort of the number of losses you think you've had, you may say, I don't know, 3, 4, 5, because you may think about, unfortunately, those sort of big seismic losses that you've had and particular deaths, and people will focus on death initially. But if we unpick that a little bit more, we do start to explore some of those other losses. So the kinds of things that featured on my list of losses were around moving geographically, because I've done that several times, were around losses that happened to my family before I was born, but I know they had an impact on my own upbringing. There were a couple of deaths in there and a couple of people that have died. But there were also things like losses of friendships. There was a loss of a relationship I had with an organisation, and this has become a little bit of a theme actually with some clients around churches, because when people have a relationship, such a close relationship with an organisation to do with religion, where you meet very frequently, you have quite sort of in-depth, good connections with people, and you share a lot about yourself. If you decide to take yourself out of that situation, and perhaps, again, just a geographic move means you're not part of that church or that religious group anymore, there can be a sense of loss to do with that as well. So that can be a really powerful exercise, because it helps us explore some of these other losses which could be having an impact on the loss that you think you bring to the approach in the first place. And actually the work with a specialist can be really interesting, because in every case so far, my clients have come telling me they want to resolve the X loss. And actually the first loss that they've worked on to complete a relationship has not been that one.
It's so interesting, because I am sitting here when you asked that question, I started thinking, and I went to a place I would have never imagined. I'm 53 years old, and I went to when I was 9 years old, and we moved, and I lost so many things in that move. I lost my best friend. I moved from the city to the country. My whole lifestyle changed. And this just was an epiphany, guys, right on the podcast. But I also started to gain a substantial amount of weight as a child at that point. Guess what? I bet you it was all triggered in that loss. But I hadn't really put that together. But I bet you, there's multiple factors, right? That was going on in that time of my life. But yeah, that was a big loss. So I think we don't think about those things.
No, and even another one which really surprised me, grief following holidays and following travel, because I think it's quite common, and I definitely do it. I think it's quite common, even when you go on holiday for a short period, you get into a routine of we're doing this, and we get up and we eat that particular food, or we go to that particular place. And even if you've only been somewhere once, there is a little bit of a sense of potential for grief when you then take yourself out of that situation. And that was one that just baffled me at first. I was thinking, how on earth do you link a holiday with grief? But actually, if we think back to the definitions around just a normal and natural reaction to a loss,
Yeah.
and actually something that happens as a result of a change in patterns of behaviour, it all kind of clicks into place. So I've had people who've been very sad and feeling like there's kind of unfinished business around places that they've been to, because there's a kind of sense of grief around that as well.
That's so interesting. But I can picture that when you think about a vacation, you call it a holiday, but a vacation or the holidays, because what comes to my mind is a closeness we have with our family, right? Even in either of those things, you're out of the work zone, you're out of the day-to-day hustle and bustle of your responsibilities, and you have this sort of perfect little scenario where everybody's just having fun and everybody's really close, and then it goes away. And of course we miss that, right?
Yeah, and January blues is a common thing, and I don't know if you have it too after kind of Thanksgiving celebrations and those kind of things, that everyone feels a bit flat because we've been doing nice things, but also we've been doing things that quite often in families are very routine based. People have their routines of what they do. I'm always fascinated to hear what people do on Christmas Day, what people do on Thanksgiving Day, what people do around other religious holidays or cultural times that they spend together. People have a little routine of things they do. And when you break that routine, whether that routine has been broken through choice or through somebody not being there that was there previously, it's no surprise that people start to feel the grief around those kinds of times, because we have a pattern about what we do here, and we've changed that.
So interesting. I think that, I mean, the main message out of all of that was that there is a lot more loss, and it's not just obviously, the death of someone we're really close to is the big, right? The big thing. It is quite inevitable. I mean, I'm learning through these series, our own and the ones we love. I mean, it is quite inevitable, but it's still something very traumatic and difficult to get over when it happens, even though we know at some point it is going to happen. So
Sure.
yeah, it's an interesting thing. What surprises you the most? So you've been doing this now for a bit, and what you went through yourself and with your family, and then working with other people. What surprises you the most about this grief journey and this work?
I'm amazed that we're all still standing, if I'm honest. Because when you hear people's stories, and particularly, I think over the last couple of years with COVID, and we've kind of had a chance that there's been quite a lot of kind of introspection going on, I think, and quite a lot of people reassessing where they're going, what they're doing, who they're spending their time with. Just hearing people's stories through that, and I think for me, I've kind of cocooned myself, and I've shut myself away a little bit. We had the kind of luxury of COVID to do that. COVID was helpful and unhelpful in probably an equal measure, because it as a family who weren't geographically close, it was actually really difficult to grieve together. But in some ways, I didn't need to then go out and be normal, because nobody was being normal around that time. So it was a really, really strange time. So I don't know. It's as I say, I do wonder now. I listen to everybody else's stories and how people have got through what they've got through. We are tremendously resilient as human beings, unbelievably resilient. And you just look around and you think, how do you get up every day? How do you go to work every day with the things that you told me of, the experiences that you've had, and the things that you've managed to cope with? So I think I'm at one amazed at people's ability to actually get on and keep performing, but actually it's very reassuring, because it's given me quite a lot of hope that this is possible. And I think that was one of the things that was probably the most difficult in the very early days after Mary Lou died, because with it being a sudden death of somebody young, everything everywhere I looked was telling me that this is not good, and worse things are probably on the horizon, because often this leads to family breakup. This leads to perhaps illness, perhaps elements of poor mental health and all those kinds of things. And I just thought, I don't need any more bad stories. I need a bit of hope and support within all this. So actually, what I do get from the grief recovery work is working with other people who also have been through some pretty tough times, but are being really strong and being really resilient, and helping me learn actually some ways to do that too. So yeah, it's difficult to kind of imagine how we're all managing to to keep going, and particularly again, as I say, the last couple of years, we've all had such an upheaval of different ways of going about our work life. That's changed for many people. Different ways that we work with support our families, and we spend time with families. That's all changed. So I think it's a really tough one to kind of understand how we are still here and still performing.
I think when you say that, you make me think of, the whole premise of my podcast and my Facebook group is around life being messy and it being hard. And, we have all these challenges but we can do hard things. And one of the goals I had in setting out to do this was to bring some inspirational stories and some tools to our toolboxes to help us get through those difficult times, because we are all going to have them. There's different seasons, and, some of us are up right now, and, unfortunately we're going to come down and come back up again. But yeah, I'm with you. It's so fascinating to watch how we have this resilience, and it's almost, it's fantastic. It's phenomenal, right? Like, how do we get through some of these things? When you look at them at the start, it's like you couldn't possibly get through it. But then looking back, we do. We just do.
We do, and some of the things, and I'm sure your audience will be familiar with some of the suggestions around, things like gratitude journals and keeping notes of things that make you smile and make you happy. I personally find that really helpful, and I think there's evidence to support that's actually a really positive thing to do, and it can sort of make a real difference. So trying to keep some of those habits, and I think leaning into the habits when things are going relatively okay, because then they're there for you when they're not, rather than only seeking out those habits when you need them. And again, my grief clients, I've been really surprised that I think I've only had 2 clients that I would describe as kind of in crisis. I thought at the outset it'd be those sorts of people that would approach me, but actually it's not. It's been people who are coming with what I would suggest is grief from situations that happened quite some time ago. And obviously, time's relative, so quite some time for you might not be quite some time for me. But it's when people start to talk about things, from the last decade or those sorts of time periods, I kind of expected the people that would approach me or respond to my offer would be people who needed stuff immediately. But actually, it's more about giving you those kind of resilience tools that mean, as you say, when the inevitable happens, you've got them there and ready. So that has surprised me as well. And I think also it's just a feature of time as it is now, because people are looking for something else, and people are trying to seek that additional support, maybe looking for some guidance. I think we're on a bit of a paradigm shift of how we view the world. So I see it as a little element of that people want to have some ways to see the world slightly differently, and not just go into the same old patterns.
Yeah, that's interesting. I would have guessed that the people that come to you were going through some immediate grief. And so that is interesting to me, that it's mostly people that are trying to deal with some past grief. That is interesting.
Yeah.
But like you said, there's a lot going on right now, and a lot piling on right now. So I think for a lot of people, it's probably the culmination of a bunch of stuff, would be my guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And recognizing that accumulation.
Yeah.
That if you've had perhaps a series of bereavements, that's not a series of one bereavement. It's, that's kind of an accumulation. So it's worth being aware of that.
Well, as we wrap up, I want to just give you an opportunity. Is there anything that we didn't touch on that you think would benefit the audience in knowing or thinking about, especially anybody going through this type of journey?
Yeah, sure. I think a couple of things. I mentioned at the start around this sense of being on the kind of outside, um, and not perhaps the closest to what was happening. And that is what led me to write about, okay, these are things that you could do if you're supporting other people who are grieving. So I've got a couple of those that may be helpful. And it really isn't rocket science. These are things that I've gleaned from other things that I've read or just from my own experience that have worked for me. So I think if you are helping people who are grieving at the moment, one thing I mentioned before about being quite concrete about what you can offer to do and then following through with that offer can be really, really helpful. So maybe have a think about, is there anything that your grieving person is not able to do for themselves at the moment, that maybe things you normally do quite quickly and easily in the margins of your life? And is that walking the dog? Is that cutting the lawn? Is that helping with tasks around the house and things like that you could give some practical help with, as well as the emotional help? When it comes to the emotional help, I think, again, obvious things, but sometimes we forget acknowledging those special days. So there will be days coming up. So there will be the obvious things around birthdays and anniversaries, but there'll be other things depending on who the person is. That'll be Mother's Day, Father's Day, those types of things. So I think it's worth being mindful that if we have that opportunity to acknowledge that grief for the other person, it's something that we can do to both honour the person that's lost, but also help the person who is grieving to know that someone has remembered. And again, none of this is universal truth, but it's just this idea that if you can acknowledge, it's just that knowledge that somebody's there for you and somebody's remembered, somebody has thought about it, because it's likely that on that day that's what you're going to be consumed with. I think also from my experience, the days leading up to that anniversary can sometimes be the most difficult, because actually when the day comes, you deal with it, but that anticipation can be hard. So even just acknowledging that those anniversaries are coming can be a really positive thing to do, because actually when the day arrives, you've done it then. It's sometimes about how am I going to feel on that day? What am I going to possibly do to make myself feel better on that day?
That's a good one.
Yeah, what can I do to honour the person on that day? And possibly a sense of, there's a right and wrong, which I don't believe, but there's possibly a sense of, I want to do the right thing and I feel tremendously under pressure to do the right thing on those days. So even looking out for people in the days leading up to special days and anniversaries, or things like Mother's Day or Father's Day, or those kind of traditional days as well. And I think really the last one is just around just really being aware of how the grieving person is responding to whatever it is you're trying to do, and just use all your senses. You probably know what the right thing is to do. You don't need me to tell you that, but just be aware, see how you're being received, and just be open to feedback. And if you can have a really open, positive communication channel, that will help you and will help them. So I know when I've been on the other side of this, I've kind of said, look, I'm expecting to acknowledge it's your father's anniversary on such and such a day. Is that okay? Is that actually helpful for you? And sometimes people have said yes, and sometimes people have said no. As I said, it's not a universal truth. So just being open to that feedback, and use your eyes and ears. They'll tell you, but ask the questions if you can have that relationship as well. And if somebody says, actually, I don't want to talk about it, well, that's okay. That's fine, because it's not about you and it's about them. So just use all your senses and have the confidence that you know what to do. But I think overall, do something, don't do nothing, because actually doing nothing can be one of the most difficult things. If people actually don't recognise and don't acknowledge, that can be the hardest thing, certainly.
I think those are great tips that people can put into practice. That last one has come up repeatedly, especially with somebody that I talked with that went through a significant loss of his wife. And he reminded us that we're often afraid to bring it up because we're afraid we're going to make them sad or we're going to, right? And he said, I'm already going through it. I'm already thinking about it 24/7. I'm already, if it's that kind of day, I'm already, whatever stage you're in, obviously it's different, but you're not going to impact me in a negative way by bringing it up. So I think that's a great message to keep reinforcing to people because we don't think about it that way. And I do think we tiptoe a little bit around it.
Yeah, I always say you're not going to remind me.
Yeah.
This won't have slipped my mind.
Yeah.
And I think the only sort of opposite argument to that would be if people are in a situation where they are trying to hold it together and you mention something, but that's when I say just use your eyes and ears and just be, and I think I would prefer to try rather than it looking like I'm not trying. So I do take that approach of I will say something, but I will also listen carefully. And if someone says, actually, I'd rather you didn't, then you honor that and you respect that, obviously.
Great feedback. Thank you for that. So for everybody listening, we're going to put all your information, all the links to your stuff in the show notes. Just a reminder, 16 Days of Sudden Death, What to Say is out there. They can get it on Amazon or on your website, which we'll put the link to. Great quick read, but with some real good tips in it besides obviously the touching story, but some really good tips in there around how to interact with people going through it. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And yes, if I can be of any sort of more support, please do reach out to me because I'm happy to discuss with people how we may be able to help.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to this episode of Message in the Middle with Marianne. If you enjoyed the podcast, please take a minute to share it and write a review as it helps bring new listeners to our audience. If you'd like to keep the conversation going between episodes, please join us at Facebook group Message in the Middle with Marianne.